Welcome to TezTalks Radio. I'm your host, Marissa True, and on this show, we bring together the people within our Tezos community and the Web3 space that are making an impact. Today, I'm joined by Jesse Damiani, who wears many, many hats. Jesse is a curator, writer, and advisor in new media art, and he's also the founder of Post Reality Labs based in LA. Hi, Jesse. Welcome to the show. How are you?
Hi. Thanks for having me. Doing very well. How are you?
In that entire list, did I miss anything out?
Oh, we don't have to do all bio stuff. It's all Googleable.
Okay, so we will leave it to the audience that are curious enough to read probably an entire manuscript of all the things that you do. That was the simplest that I could distill it down to
That's
because
great.
you are very, very active in the space and it's very impressive. But before we dig into all of your current work, as is customary on the show, can you share a bit more about your personal background and sort of how you ended up in the Web3 art space?
Sure. Yeah. So my professional background, professional is sort of a funny term in this case, but my professional background is in poetry. I was doing an MFA in poetry, and my professors at the time were very kind to deliver the sort of tough love, advice of, it's great that you're doing this, but figure out what you're going to do for work. So I moved out to Los Angeles thinking I would pursue a career in screenwriting, encountered the then early VR community, at least for this like time around the bend with VR. This was early 2014. And that community was already somewhat overlapped with the also still pretty young blockchain community. So I sort of began to have some visibility into Bitcoin and Ethereum. But in the meantime, I ended up trying my hand at being a founder for a screenwriting and project management tool for virtual and augmented reality stories, which led me to Boost VC, which is an early stage startup accelerator run by Adam Draper. And this was essentially during ICO token sale boom season. So I was like right in the sort of thick of it in spring 2017 when that was all happening. So I'd been a writer in various forms and wearing various hats, one of which was journalism for many years. And so one thing that I started doing was covering. At that time, I was one of the people in mainstream media covering altcoins. And so that kind of like threw me into the mess of what would sort of become, or like in the parlance, what would become Web3. And concurrent with all of that, I had begun curating new media art exhibitions. And so there was just a lot of kind of like collaging of different communities. So yeah, that's how it all kind of like swirled together.
I think many people can relate when it comes to taking a particular degree and being told, what are you going to do with it? And what are people going to hire you for? I had this exact same experience when I took up my degree in psychology. And I think still to this day, my parents are wondering what I'm actually using it for. So I think that's a kind of a common
Hard-hitting
starting ground.
questions.
Yeah, these are the questions that you are burdened with as a 18 to 21-year-old. But what it sounds like is that you were always sort of interacting with this relationship between emerging technologies and the art space, whether it was writing or journalism, poetry, uh, visual art, screenwriting, and virtual reality. And I think back in 2014, virtual reality was very much regarded as still a bit of a gimmick. It wasn't really advanced enough to be as immersive as we see it being used as today. And so, was that something where you felt like you could kind of predict its trajectory and you understood its potential 10 years ago? Or was this something you thought, well, it's just worth experimenting and worth discovering?
That's a really good question. And like, not to be coy, but I would say both. On the one hand, I think it's different now because when you look back at some of the ways people were talking about like putting on a headset for the first time, it almost feels a little cringe because of how sort of euphoric people were. But I think that captures the sort of delta between experiencing media in flat formats and experiencing it in an immersive format. And now there's a lot more literacy and people have more experience doing it, and there's a full gamut of, really amazing experiences, but also really, subpar experiences. And so you don't get quite that like level of like, this like, yeah, euphoric is the word I'd sort of describe. A lot of evangelists were sort of created during that time. For me, coming to it, I was approaching it from a storytelling standpoint, and I was really struck by the ways that it as a medium um, really perturbed the ways that storytellers were used to communicating narrative in film and TV in particular, but in linear formats in general. Um, the idea that you would be ceding this much control to the participants in an experience, the idea that you would be considering what's going on 180 degrees opposite of what was being framed, like things like this were seemed like really rich new questions that were emerging as a result. And the other thing to sort of reference that was happening during this time is that Hollywood got in, and well, Hollywood and tech, but both Hollywood and certain tech players didn't want to miss the wave the way they felt like they had missed the wave with mobile, with the iPhone and everything that sort of came after the sort of development of the iPhone. So there was this kind of rush and this sort of sense that it was going to replace Hollywood, is going to replace films, and there's all this talk of like there's even sort of somebody in a tongue-in-cheek way referred to movies like a traditional sort of feature film as flatties, like so just to sort of capture the way people were approaching the sort of juxtaposition between immersive um, and sort of more traditional storytelling formats. So in that perspective, I think it was easy to determine that over the next few years there was going to be a lot of energy here, and there were going to be a lot of open questions that were being either answered or explored in more depth. And so I was able to orient myself along. It's kind of like surfing a wave. Like I didn't make the wave, but I was progressively getting better at surfing it, and sort of identifying the companies and the individuals who were really leading us into new wild places. Um, yeah, I think I sort of answered the question. I can't remember if I had a final beat to that answer.
It's interesting you use the analogy of a wave because that's also how I've sort of interpreted it. But there's also the point at which the wave starts to build, which is what I think 2014 looks like. And then it's when the wave breaks, which is, I think, roughly around where we stand now, a decade later. And I guess
Mm,
it's another example of how the technologists who have built this technology have a bit of foresight into what its potential applications are going to be, but no one thinks it's cool until much, much later. Like it's almost like, the nerds discover it first, and then society only deems it cool way after the fact, and then we claim it as our own original. But when it comes to things like Hollywood, and this is a bit of a sidetrack question, I guess, before we get into more of the Web3 art stuff, it always sounds like when these emerging technologies arise, there is this fear of being left behind. There is
mm,
this, if we do not adopt this as quickly as possible, we risk sort of falling into irrelevance.
mm,
Do you think, over the course of those 10 years, whether it relates to virtual reality or this Web3 space, that this is sort of the undercurrent of why we see so much activity, whether it's, the traditional art world, whether it's cinema, whether it's any medium for that matter? Is it always underpinned by this fear of losing relevance?
mm. FOLR doesn't quite have the same ring as FOMO, I guess, but
No, it does.
yeah, I mean, I absolutely. I think it's a really good question and a really astute sort of insight underlying the question. I also think that, so I definitely agree. Full stop. Next sentence. I think that we're entering a phase, and I think this is embodied both in the sort of new waves, uh, as you said, with Web3, the wave has kind of crashed. The water, the sort of currents are reforming, and generative AI, the web has definitely peaked. It hasn't crashed yet, but we've sort of, there's more sort of bearish sentiment. We're starting to see some of the, particularly on the legal side, we're seeing some of the decisions being handed down and the sort of lawsuits that are being sort of actively pursued and tried, that the kind of boom season that people were sort of heralding and the sort of change to everything also yet again is not going to be as explosive as was originally promised. It seems to me that the general public, and of course people that are sort of more embedded within particular industries, have been head faked one too many times by sort of tech hype. And coming off of the recession, we had this period of incredible excess liquidity that allowed for a highly speculative investing, but also this kind of like cult of personality. Believe me because I say it. WeWork, Uber, Airbnb, it's the future, and just believe us, and like number go up, stocks, stonks. But we're having this moment of reckoning now where those companies, I mean, I hesitate to even call them sort of Web 2 companies, that they are, but these companies that were meant to disrupt the industry that they were sort of purporting to disrupt are in many ways sort of defaulting either sort of, like, take an example like Uber. You still have the convenience, but now you just pay for the convenience. Like, now, arguably, Uber's cost more than it would have cost to get a taxi in the past, but you can do it through the app on your phone, which is still something people are willing to pay for or whatever. I think we're reaching this moment now where people are much more cautious. I think people feel burned by the sort of the hype, particularly around the early NFT metaverse hype of 2021. And
Mhm.
I think people were already a little wilier with the generative AI stuff, though of course it's a whole different can of worms. And so I'm noticing actually more hesitation and more of like a we we want to engage, but we're going to engage thoughtfully. We're not going to kind of like throw everything at it the way we have in some of these other waves.
Right. I mean, I completely agree with you that I think the world has sort of got trust issues now with the evangelists that have sold us, what for many turned out to just be snake oil. I think, in the last uh, crypto cycle, like the bull market, there was so much noise that was going on that it was very difficult to distinguish between something that was legitimate versus, something that was ultimately going to be a rug pull,
Totally.
sorry. But then when you look more into the creative spaces, and here's where I kind of want to bring artists into the picture, the merit and the promise of technology like NFTs, it's still a prevailing narrative. It's still a very powerful one about the ability to earn royalties, about the continued ability to monetize off their work. But again, because there is so much public discourse that is seeking to undermine that potential because of this skepticism and because of these trust issues, we risk losing it altogether. I think Rolling Stone just came out with an article titled something along the lines of, and I'm probably butchering it, but your NFTs are finally genuinely worthless.
Mm,
And so when you have this conflicting media, I think it can cause many to lose focus or like lose a sense of faith in what's actually being built.
mm.
So from that, I kind of want to bridge the conversation into, do you still think that there's still a lot of merit to what this technology can provide as it relates to artists specifically?
Absolutely. I want to. You asked a really. I keep saying this, but you're good at asking questions. Um, you asked a really thoughtful question, so I want to sort of approach it kind of in this like prismatic way.
Perfect. Would love that.
There definitely excellent. There definitely was um, way too much hype, and we knew it at the time. We were talking about. I mean, you and me probably talked about this at the time. I don't recall, but I remember these conversations happening a lot, where it was like, "This is just functionally not sustainable. This is not how this is not how this ecosystem will sustain itself."
Hmm.
However, I am in a backwards way. I'm a little bit glad for the hype, because without the hype, I don't think anybody would have cared to even bother to now be writing the sort of like X, not can't say X anymore. Like the fill in the blank thing is dead. And by the way, as an aside, like as somebody who's been in VR, almost a decade now, I feel kind of like the kid in the back, like smoking the cigarette, where it's like, oh yeah, another like round of fill in the blank thing is dead. Like anytime people are bothering to write fill in the blank thing is dead, they're, in my experience, that is incorrect. When something is dead, you just stop hearing about it. When somebody's writing to tell you something is dead, they have a particular position they're wanting to express, and it specifically means that the thing is not dead.
Hmm.
Um, And I don't mean that in an apologist way, because where I'm coming from is that from the beginning, I realize I'm sort of tangenting with histories, but zooming, like sort of rewinding, I felt a little bit burned by. I wasn't trained as a financial writer. So when I started covering altcoins, I was approaching it the way I was covering other technologies, which is I was sort of like signal scanning and trying to look for um, moments that felt relevant from the sort of public narrative perspective. And I really had no experience what it meant to write about things that people had a financial position in. And I had moments where people would tell me that they invested in particular coins because I wrote about them, which in my mind, not to sort of reference any names in particular, but I was like, oh my God, don't invest. Like, first of all, don't invest in anything just because somebody wrote about it. But second of all, God, really don't invest in those. Um, and so I felt really burned by that, because especially like when the market kind of tipped in 2018, I suddenly felt the full weight of that responsibility. So as NFTs were happening and as artists were starting to really push into those directions, and as there started to be, even at those times, very small markets for those things, I really stayed out of saying anything publicly about it. I was observing, but I was like, I really want to kind of come to this in a more thoughtful way. And because of that, my approach to them was, these actually solve existing problems in the art market. And they don't solve everybody's problem, and they're not a problem solving element for every imaginable problem that the art market would generate, but they solve enough problems that they're worthwhile. And if another technology or another sort of like community connected to a technology comes along that I think across the board does it better than blockchain, great. I'm not wedded to blockchain per se. But the idea of inverting some of the broken aspects of the art market, particularly the aspects of obfuscation, the ways in which artworks are used for everything from, bribes and tax fraud to sort of speculative investing, and treating sort of blue chip art the way you would treat like sort of real estate investing. That whole culture, um, there are observable problems in that culture from where I sit relative to the
Right.
world that I would like to see exist.
Right.
And even if Web3 were never to sort of eat into that world and just create a whole separate space where creative people and artists could establish new modes of expressing value and new forms of community, then that's a worthwhile thing. That is solving problems. Um, I my belief in those ideas hasn't changed at all. And if anything, I have the luck, because my livelihood does not depend on the sales of NFTs. I have the
Mhm.
luxury of actually really enjoying winters, because winters are when people kind of getting to that thing of like, boom season's over, it's the tourists are gone. We got to figure out what actually works. And there's a lot about capitalism that I really resent. But one thing that I think is working in this context is it creates a very, it sort of clears that funnel, and the sort of attention zooms into how does our, company, our initiative, our project stay alive.
Right.
And though not everything that comes from that is good, there are unique good things that come from periods like that. So anyway, that's a longer answer than what you asked for, but still believe in the premise, and I actually think behind the scenes there's a lot of really important work happening.
Right. Well, to address a prismatic answer with another prismatic question, there's a few things I want to touch on. So, with regards to, I guess, all of the noise that followed the original NFT hype cycle and what that's actually tangibly offered, even if it caused a whole lot of chaos and mayhem, and some people losing money, some people making a lot of money. Um, this idea that it was essentially powerful because it shone a spotlight on industry grade issues that were not necessarily talked about or addressed or uh, thought as something that was to be solved. And then while blockchain was sort of marketed to everybody as this panacea of like problem solving, like it could solve absolutely anything, but then while others argued that it was a solution looking for a problem,
Mm,
when NFT technology was relayed to the art world, it was almost like it was built for it. Like it was so specifically applicable that there were no real ways to shy away from that. And exactly as you said, with regards to, the sort of closed door deal making, the ambiguities, the opacity that the art world runs on and rests on, breaking into that was almost revolutionary. But then what we had was a lot of industry resistance against it, because essentially what you're doing is challenging the old guard. So it forces the question of, we've seen all of these healthy creator and artist ecosystems, particularly on Tezos. Tezos really carved a niche for itself in terms of the art community that existed on it. And then this conversation, or it was almost like a one-way conversation on trying to pressure the traditional art world into adopting this sort of technology. And then you had this sort of middle ground where many art institutions were um, trying to incorporate it and trying to embrace it and trying to understand its merits. But then again, with the bear market, a lot of that skepticism arose once more. So there's basically two questions, one of which is, do you think there is necessary convergence between these two spaces, or can they actually
Mm.
continue to exist separately from one another? And also, do you think that so much damage has been done with, everyone being disillusioned and jaded by the dangerous world of crypto and blockchain, that perhaps we've passed the point of recovery, or is this something that can kind of be redeemed?
Mm. I guess on the latter question, um, in the work that I do with Protocol Labs, our focus is right now is in interacting with institutions around decentralized storage, and just from an approach, like from viewing this the way that a museum or institution is going to look at this, this is about as um, uh, an unscary of a prospect as you can imagine, because there's no attempt to financialize, there's no attempt to push in any particular direction. It's just like we could build new types of archives, and maybe those archives could actually do more interesting things in the current tech stack that you're using for them. And maybe there are ways to digitize analog works and sort of incorporate that. And even that, you always have your champions at the institution, and then of course you have the skeptics. Going through that has really given me a really clear view into how much, just not just mistrust, but a sense that the subject is big and messy enough that it would just take too much time to cut through it to bother with it. So I guess the answer that I would say to the question is, I think it's a matter of a time scale, because I think that there will be more highly visible examples where people are able to do things either better or using sort of separate affordances that aren't currently available with given tools, that will be appealing and sort of get people's brains thinking. And then you have the kind of like 18-month cycle of like, I'm thinking about it, I'm circulating it with my colleagues, they're circulating it with their man. It's like these are bureaucratic structures.
Hmm.
So do I think that the kind of like hype culture and the sort of rampant greed and rug pulls and all of that damaged how Web3 could integrate with traditional infrastructure? Absolutely. I also think that there are enough merits, and there will be enough wins that over time they'll amass. Now, this is also I'm discounting any number of factors that could happen in the economy that could, put dents in this. So all requisite caveats there. To the first question as to whether I think they can intersect, there are some fundamental sort of, as you identified, there are these fundamental places where the power structures of the art market in particular don't want the solutions. Like the people with the least power, who comprise the sort of vast majority participating in the art market, would want these solutions, like something like royalties. But the people with power, who is the smallest number, but that have the vastest, power and resources don't want it. And that is a very common and very difficult situation to enact change in. And I think that that will continue to be a dynamic that will require, incredible amounts of creativity, innovation, finesse, like using the cool factor and the sort of alternative currency, and like finding unlikely allies. Like all of those things will be necessary for the convergences that will occur. I think that those convergences might make up 15 to 20% of what the sort of like Web3 art sort of broader ecosystem and community um, will be. I think that in large part, what I would expect to happen, if the successful version would look something like what happened with street art, where it was deemed, or lowbrow art, out here in California, something that's deemed not art by the establishment for a very long time, until certain people use its kind of like unsavory status to turn it into a category, and they do so effectively that it actually is just, it kind of comes in through the left. It's like, it doesn't make sense, but people are just kind of like, well, I guess we got to kind of accept it. So that's where I could see this sort of like alternative Web3 ecosystem kind of crashing back in. But that's even presupposing that it needs to. Like,
Yeah.
with my connections to the sort of museum and institutional world, I like it when those things happen, and I'm a champion of that. But I also think that there's all this other amazing stuff that doesn't need to happen within the system that in many ways is broken. Like, we have the chance in these communities to build new paths and establish new means of, expressing value and building community. And I get excited when I see things that really just operate completely from the ground up, from from aspirationally in the direction of Web3. So yeah, that's how it.
Right. So essentially, we're looking for or waiting for the Banksy moment where this unrefined or like poorly considered art is suddenly legitimized within the right circles, or like I guess the elite circles as they are, just because they tend to hold the most money, but not necessarily because they're the houses of the best creativity. And I think on top of that, there's a very dominant narrative in this space about the financialization of art. But one thing you alluded to earlier, which I think is often lost on many, is the archival ability of this technology, and the ability, like for mediums like digital art, where we rely on and trust on the internet, but then essentially we're dealing with servers that if they were to crash, we would lose art for forever. So if we are able to protect and preserve and conserve these works in a way where 50, 100 years down the line they are still accessible to us, is also a very powerful thing. Because when we speak about financialization, what we often lose sight of is the cultural value of this entire exercise. And so while I tend to agree with your prediction that I think the overlap between the two spaces is probably going to be around the 20% mark, I don't think we're going to see total convergence. I think, if anything, what we've seen in the traditional art space is experimentation with the technology, participation, but not real infrastructural incorporation, as it were. And so when we think about the cultural value proposition of these works, and you look at chains like Tezos and the amount of activity that's on it, do you think that that's something that is going to actually stand the test of time? Or how do we make a point of considering NFTs and blockchain in that regard, rather than simply, the monetizable aspect of this? Because while all of these artworks can be preserved on chain, whether it's ever sought out is another matter. So kind of where do we draw the line between what we want to use this technology for, and even if it's a potential function for it, do you think we're going to use it?
There's a lot there. Uh, you know, the Web3 is, it's kind of the blessing and the curse. Like, I often try to like zoom out in and try to look at the abstract to what are the claims about reality, that a given new thing, are challenging. And what are the, when you take that sort of abstraction, what are the possible risks and benefit to that, to the challenge to those claims? And so when I think about what Web3 proposes as its maybe idealistic challenge, is kind of extending the from the very beginning with the Bitcoin white paper, but broadening to, could there be truer forms of democracy that exist on the internet? And could we build power structures that foster more democratic aims? And that's coming with this like whole, like, we in large part are not sort of living up to those ideals as a community broadly, not pointing fingers at any in person in particular or entity in particular. But the risk with that claim is that if you're trying to be sort of purely democratic and you're trying to disintermediate and sort of get rid of the sort of clogs that we see occur in what we sort of understand to be democratic function or corporate function, the risk is that you have to have, sort of proverbially speaking, bodies in the building doing that work, maintaining those structures for it to progress. Where, when I kind of see the landscape of like all these different blockchains making these different sort of attempts, it's like there's this mix of kind of jockeying to do particular things really well or to foster particular types of community. And I think that those bets ultimately, if they succeed or not, have to do with how the underlying society and populace feels about those things. And so, like you ask about Tezos, Tezos has spent a lot of time and energy fostering, a really vibrant artist community. And whether or not that community is able to draw in new developers, artists, what have you, is in many ways dependent on that being valued at a sort of sub rosa level. As it stands, it looks like even with the market being down, Tezos still continues to be a place where digital artists gravitate. And so, and I think that there's probably similar examples with other blockchains and sort of other verticals. Um, but it's, I mean, this is the kind of like inherent open, the part of what makes the risk so appealing is that it, or so, part of what makes the, future possible benefit so appealing is that there is an inherent risk there because of what it's challenging.
Right. So we still have to risk it all if we really want to instill or enact any kind of real change. And I think what you touched upon is the fact that blockchain has been sold to many as a solution to our economy, our politics, our society, our culture. And that is a lot for one technology to be able to do. So I think we all need to sort of take a breath and take it step by step and maybe industry by industry. And I think with relation to the art world in particular, because as we said, there is such like a clear cut reason why this technology could work for it. One thing I want to touch upon is the role of the intermediary, because blockchain was all about decentralization, essentially cutting out all of those clogs, as you put it. But in the art world, many of those figures maintain their relevance and should maintain their relevance. So what do you think is the future of, the curator, the auction house, the gallery, and the museum, especially as your role as a curator as well? Like, how do you see your position changing over the course of time as this technology slowly but surely becomes a part of the art world?
I think that what excites me is the idea that different folks from within a given ecosystem are learning to speak each other's languages and seeing the places where maybe they have a knack for something. And we've seen this in the past. Like, I can think of a few people right off the top of my head who, even prior to Web3, had framed their sort of core identity as artists, but they started organizing kind of DIY shows, da 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 da. All of a sudden, 5 years later, they're a director at a gallery, a curator at a gallery. And because curating is a related but very different set of skills to the art making. And I think that the whole proposition of disintermediation allows it sort of shakes things up to where people can kind of look around and be like, I never really thought that I would do that or that I would want to do that. But there's this moment for me to kind of experiment with it in a low stakes way. And maybe what I'll find is, yeah, actually, like, I'm an artist and I hate curating and I don't want to be sending emails all day or whatever. Or maybe it's like, oh, wow, I really have a knack for this and I want to do both. I want to kind of like wear both hats as both artist and curator. And I have new avenues by which to do that now. And I have even virtual venues where I can be doing that type of work. Again, zooming out to the level of abstraction, I don't believe that pure centralization or pure decentralization, I don't believe that either of those two things are bad or good. I think that those things exist as sort of poles on a spectrum. And in an ideal scenario, we're trying to find the right balance for each of our individual selves, but also the structures that we're a part of, the structures that we sort of help facilitate the creation of. So you take something like a curator, and I think there are aspects of curation that have been quite toxic, particularly relative to the art market, particularly the ways that the curator sometimes is overlapped with dealer. And you see some of the ways that that's also then, again, not with the same words, but echoing in some of the Web3 circles, where there's a certain type of compromise that occurs if the work that you would curate to say this has historical or zeitgeisty import is also something I want to make a lot of money on, versus if you're just doing it for the sort of love of the game, versus if you're somebody who's like, my whole job is to sell this thing and I'm not trying to, kind of get into the canon making. It's, so when I sort of think about myself and I think about these sort of like decentralization and decentralization as poles, I view my responsibility in saying I'm a curator as I'm both paying attention to currents in popular culture. I'm doing my best to understand the past and the future. And I'm trying to align those ideas with artists who I think are translating those in really meaningful ways. And to actually say no way more than I say yes. Like, really think about curating a body of works that is going to communicate something that feels to me, based on evidence, is relevant. And whether or not I'm successful is, comes down to how well I'm doing that or not. And so on the one hand, I really don't mind the idea that lots of other people are starting to curate. I'm infinitely better of a curator, because I also came into curating not with Web3, with VR and AR, just as somebody who loved art and was connected to VR and AR artists. And that's how I kind of like T-boned into curating. But I've learned so much about curating in the course of doing it. And so creating these open spaces where people can do this, I'm a huge fan of. And I think what that then creates is a higher level of competition of like, you got to do it well. So that feels invigorating to me. I also recognize why, if you're somebody who, got your, master's and PhD and went through that trouble and is a deep subject matter expert, why you might feel like somebody just up and saying they're a curator is an affront to, the time and effort you've put into it. And I guess my sort of counter to that is them saying that doesn't actually cheapen the ways that you are a curator. It's just a different mode. And of yet, I haven't ever observed something where, somebody who is a subject matter expert in a particular, digital art, new media art subject, was sort of denied work because, some barbarian at the gates sort of robbed it of them. Maybe it's happened, but I think these things are messy. And zooming out, I think that the mess yields better outcomes for the public and for art lovers.
Right. So essentially, we're seeing the hybridization of a lot of these roles and like a lot of a blurring between what the responsibilities are. And yes, there might be some ethical implications. Like, for example, if you are a curator and a dealer and you're skimming the top of the top off of whatever you are dealing in, there are necessary responsibilities, or I guess ethical guidelines that need to be in place. But I completely agree with you that I think it's like a layer of imposter syndrome within the creative space, if you think about it. Like, at what point do artists call themselves artists with a feeling of legitimacy if they never went to art school? And I think the same is true for if you are a curator or if you are an art dealer or so on. There are so many shades of gray in between the person who holds the degree and the person who does have a knack and a talent to achieve the same, or
Mm.
to apply a different kind of perspective onto the matter, which grants them value in the space. So I completely agree with you on that front. To pivot the conversation slightly, and I'm so sorry we're about to get real philosophical and technical again. So just warm your brain up for this bit too.
Take a sip of water.
I want to dig into the fact that generative art sort of had its moment in the sun over the course of last year. We saw a huge boom in it. TezTalks at Art Basel Miami. Actually, TezTalks at Art Basel throughout the course of the year was a celebration of generative art. But now we are looking at the boom of generative AI art, which has kind of sparked a lot of conversations around the originality and the labor that underpins quality art. So the question is simply, how do you see the relationship between Web3 and blockchain and AI converging? Like, is there a natural synergy between these technologies, or are we sort of trying to force puzzle pieces together?
No, I actually think there is very much a. I mean, synergy maybe is not the right word because it implies something that I wouldn't mean to say. I guess how I would say it is Web3. Like earlier, you were talking about critics claiming that Web3 was solving a problem for a question that didn't exist, or like I forget the way exactly you said it.
Mhm.
One of the one of the problems that generative AI introduces actually finds a lot of solutions in Web3 tooling. And as an overview, I would say, and as a thesis, the way that I approach art, and again, I need to have all the caveats that, as a curator and somebody who's largely working on the kind of exhibition and organizing side, I'm less at risk in terms of my day-to-day livelihood and my IP being infringed, and those are very real problems. So I'm not meaning to make light of them.
Mhm.
My sense generally is that just because you can have a really powerful, aesthetic output doesn't mean that audiences want to engage with that thing. And so largely how I'm seeing generative AI being really successful is as part of a loop within artist practices. So it's still very much the artist as author, but they're able
Mhm.
to more rapidly iterate and play with different sketch ideas. Or, I was even talking to a designer who's a really successful designer who is now able to use generative fill on Photoshop and is really impressed with what he's able to do. It's still 90% all hand created by him, but then there's this little like, oh, I need to add sunglasses to this character or whatever. So my sense is that art in the wake of conceptualism, most people when they're approaching, or I shouldn't say most people, but a lot of the art going public, art lovers, are not just looking for aesthetic outcomes. They're also looking for some engagement with the world, some engagement with a bigger idea that relates to, again, the past, the present, the future. And it is certainly possible that generative AI tools, I hate the term AI, so I'll say it for the sort of ease of use, but generative AI tools are um, able to produce these really, potentially amazing and superlative aesthetic objects, or, whatever, but without a human person guiding the why. Like, why is this in the world? People are much less likely to care. So that's there's a lot more to say about that. I actually wrote a piece called "The Creative Singularity Came and Went: What Happened." So if you want like my 10-page take on this, it's there. But that's sort of it in a nutshell. So coming back to Web3, where I think Web3 becomes really wonderful is it's proactive rather than reactive to the changes that generative AI introduce, or these tools introduce. If you are able to get ahead of things and say, I am the person who authored this, and these are the NFTs that assert that I authored this, and you can look in, from this same wallet, all of these other NFTs that I authored, then any of the different works that were maybe made in the style of, it's kind of like, oh yeah, that's cool, they're made in the style of, but this is the canon. Like, this is, as an artist, this is my body of work that I am operating from, and I can sort of appreciate the like fanfic elements of, the community wanting to make things in my style, but it's also, I'm still in control of, what I call my canon. And obviously everybody, references Holly and Matt, but I mean, Holly Plus is a really excellent example of this, where you have this tool that spawns music in her style, but there is a DAO around it that determines if any of these myriad generations that are sort of occurring from all over the place become actually part of Holly Herndon's official output. And music has its own affordances, so I'm not meaning to say that, like, every medium will have to kind of figure out what's the relationship between
Mhm.
authenticity and, the sort of signature. But sort of to put it in a nutshell, Web3 becomes that signature. It becomes that differentiating element when the products are able to be either visually, sonically, whatever, as sort of good or as, proficient as the style of something made by that person. So I actually, when particularly when Midjourney and Dolly 2 were kind of grabbing everybody's attention, it really struck me, oh, it's great that this is happening now, post the, like, we've already kind of like broken down the doors, and like everybody's kind of like, you know, gone balls to the wall with Web3. Now we know some things, and here we have this, generative AI is not a problem, but we have this problem that's been created that now Web3 can kind of step
Sure.
in and
So in a way, it's actually been a blessing that Web3 came ahead of generative AI, just because it, as you said, it was a proactive solution to many of the problems or considerations that have arisen with the rise of generative AI. But as you were saying, with regards to kind of creating a bit of a loop where artists they themselves can use these tools to facilitate their work. When we remove the barriers to this creative output, naturally it's assumed that we're kind of going to need to change our assessment of what counts as quality art or how we appraise art. And also, as you mentioned, the cultural value that this holds in our society. And I think this is probably something where you are informed through your role as a curator, but how do you see our assessments of these kinds of works changing or shifting?
it could be all kinds of ways. It could be none at all. When we look at, again, kind of looking to that apparatus of the art market, where there, and Magnus Resch talks about this, and he's where Magnus Resch and Laszlo Barabasi sort of put together this, Laszlo Barabasi's data, and Magnus put together this book, I believe it's called How to Be a Successful Artist, where basically what they demonstrated is, if you look historically over the past, I believe it's 70 years, success meaning, you are a living, working artist. Like, you make a living off of your art alone while you're alive. The factors for determining success are, if you showed in one of 10 institutions, 9 of which are in New York City, 1 is in Chicago, they're all in the US, and you had the favor of one or some among a community of 3,000 tastemakers around the world. That is a vanishingly small number of people who determine if you are, you know, finding success in
Hmm.
this context. And so the idea that just because tons of people can now generate new proficient visual, auditory, whatever content, that they don't care. Like, they may decide that they want to sort of ordain a particular generative artist or an artist using generative AI in their practice. They might not. I really don't think it's going to make a dent one way or another. So from the market side and from the traditional art world, I think when we're looking specifically to art, leaving design out for a moment, I I'm really not expecting much change. From a curatorial standpoint, I think that like like what I was referencing earlier with curation, where there's more soft ramps into trying. I think that these large models that are now publicly available create more ramps for people to go try things. And in the course of trying, they might either stumble into or actively know in advance, and the tools rise to meet them, some body of work that becomes a standout work in their practice that elevates their visibility in the public, and then creates a virtuous circle. So that I could see sort of these large models changing things. And then I guess the final sort of thing to point out here is we're talking about large models, which have largely been in vogue over the past few years. But of course, artists have used AI in their practice for decades, and even specifically just looking to neural networks for more than a decade.
Mhm.
And so you have people who have been really like at Vellum, we're doing a show with Casey Rees, who's been working with these tools forever. And his relationship with GANs in particular, generative adversarial networks, is so thoughtful and so conceptual that it then becomes an artistic engagement with that material, just like you would look at a particular brushstroke or, you
Mhm.
know, chisel in the marble as a unique idiosyncratic artistic relationship with material. So
Mhm.
too are so too is his relationship with GANs. And so that I'm excited to see more both public and critical attention for the artists who are like really kind of getting into it, whether it's with large models or small models, and I think we're seeing some of that already, but I think we'll see much more of it as well.
Right. So essentially, in that, we're drawing the distinction between someone who uses these tools as a means of generating a particular kind of output and the value that that might hold, versus someone who is engaging with the technology in more of like in a considered way, and then the value that that can also generate. So you almost have like the value that's in the intent or the drive behind the art, and the value of the output itself is sort of being on different grades of evaluation and appraisal. And also, when you speak of, this hyper elite art world that we're talking about, I personally didn't know that it was, just a few thousand people. I also didn't know that 90% of the institutions rested in New York. So it points at, bigger problems that I don't think we have time to divulge ourselves with today, with regards to, diversity and representation and, accessibility to this sort of technology and to these arenas. But you did mention a phrase earlier that you coined, which I know you've written 10 pages on, but I'd love if you can sort of summarize for us: creative singularity. What does that mean exactly, and how do you relate it back to the art world?
So the notion of the technological singularity, there's of course the singularity of like a black hole, and there's lots of singularities, but oftentimes when people are talking about the singularity, they're talking about the moment when there's an artificial super intelligence that explodes past us in capability, and within a split second even has sort of displaced us as the dominant species on Earth, or as the dominant force on Earth. I have a lot of problems with that framing in general, which is for another conversation. But it was specifically because I had problems with that framing that I wanted to use it to subvert it, as because all these generative tools, sort of with the crescendo of ChatGPT, had caused people to really be sort of pulling their hair out, like now's the moment that the singularity is happening. And I was trying to soften it and say, no, it's not. However, we have reached a creative singularity. Like we have reached a point where it is now visible to us that the pace of change of these tools is such that in a year, it will be hard to imagine certain practices being done without these tools. And I think, like, just to reference Adobe again, like the fact that Adobe has rolled out Firefly across multiple platforms, and I'm sure we should expect it across their other the rest of the creative cloud. When you look at that and you see the way that people are, really taking to generative fill and just seeing all the different like little micro moments all throughout a creative process where these things are being used, we sort of arrived at the point through these like loud visible moments where we are able to we are now in a position where increasingly it will make no sense to not use these tools as some part of your work if you are a creative person, which is not to say that you are giving over control to a given generative tool and saying like the machine made it, not me.
Mm-hmm.
It's much more about either, again, being part of that sketch process, being able to fill in a gap that you might have as an artist where maybe you're the sort of thorn in your side is you're really bad at sketching a given concept before you know create the work. Now you have a sort of tool for doing that, or you're a designer and you're using generative fill, or even like I think of like Mina Tairu, who uses like tools like Midjourney to demonstrate what's missing from data sets in how it responds to the prompts. Like that's a whole new body of work that only exists because those generative tools now exist. So when I say creative singularity, it came and went. Like these tools were sort of bubbling in the background and development was happening in the background for a long time. There was a big shot across the bow when GPT-3 first rolled out, and there were all the kind of like few paragraphs of the news story and check it out, GPT-3 wrote it actually.
Mm-hmm.
But with Chat GPT, we really see now the ways that this natural language interface for engaging with diffusion models, transformers, etc. Like that to me, I see no reality where those things don't just become commonplace for some part of people's everyday work, even if it's at the lowest level of just like, hey, write this cover letter for me, or like, hey, what's the recipe for this thing as part of my day. So yeah, that's
Right. So while the creative singularity may have come and gone, it's essentially opened up avenue for greater creativity in terms of people's ability to interact with the technology and also to question, to challenge, to explore the limitations, exactly as you said, because while these tools are powerful, that's not to suggest that we have to attribute all creative power over to it or hand over to it, nor do we need to over anthropomorphize what it's doing in terms of the creative space. But again, I think this is one of those technologies where there are so many more questions than there are answers currently. And when you are confusing the conversation with terminology like AI, AGI, superintelligence, and so on, so many people can kind of lose the distinction between those different layers, and it's very easy to resign yourself to, I guess, the robots won. So seeing how this plays out, I guess, across Web3 generative artists and generative AI artists is going to be an interesting thing. So, with that, I do want to release you from this existential question hole by asking you a light question, which is, who are some of the artists who are working within this space or across these spaces that you have an eye on or you're particularly excited about because of their novel perspective as it relates to these technologies?
there are more artists than I'm able to name, and I don't want to get sort of too into the kind of the mess of it. I'll sort of sideways answer you by saying
Sure.
I've been really excited by the energy around 01 and a lot of the artists who are actually kind of rising to this occasion of just a values based exchange, and not a financial exchange. And that collective performance is really exciting to me. I have no idea if it will work long term, but the future will tell. But I like the idea of like part of what's been so fun about Web3 is that artists really flexed as collectors for the first time, or not for the first time, but in a much bigger way than I ever remember seeing in the past. And part of what that enables is um, means of really using cultural and creative capital in idiosyncratic ways. And so something like that, caught my attention recently, and I'm just really glad to see artists rising to that occasion.
Well, Jesse, thank you so much for your perspectives. I think it is not an easy task to share clear-cut perspectives when the earth is shifting beneath your feet. So I very much appreciate, this your perspectives at this point in time. I'm sure they're going to evolve in the next 2 weeks and 2 years. And for that, we will probably have to have you back on and interview you again. But
I look forward
this
to
has
it.
been awesome. I've learned a lot about the art world. And yeah, I can't wait till our next conversation. So thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. It was a joy to be here.
Great.